I'm so used to these celebrations like American Independence Day or Canada Day, which is all hot dogs and fireworks and frisbees and fun. This was not fun. It was powerful. And there was a sorrow and a somberness to the entire gathering. The songs were sad. The faces sometimes were ashen and fixed, like carved statues of historical suffering. And I remember as I was in the march and I was looking side to side at the people, I saw old stony faces, and I kind of wanted to slither into the ears and the minds and see what they were seeing, what they remembered. This was more like the celebration of victory after the American Civil War than barbecues and fireworks and beer. So I finally did understand what I had come for and what it actually meant to march in Poland. After talking to the academics, after talking to the people on the street, after talking to the activists and the people trying to plan it, I now finally understand what it is all for. Now, the somberness, the sorrowful aspect, the sense of dirge, the sense of elegy, the sense that I was at a funeral that gives hope, which is a contradictory thing that I was still wrestling with in my mind. I knew that the next place I had to go was the center of the sorrows that Poland had experienced. I had to go to the cemetery. I had to go and visit the war graves, and I had to understand how many bodies had to be piled up to win independence for Poland, and why the celebration of Polish independence was also a soft song sung over a very deep grave. Poland's century of woe began in September of 1939, when Hitler's Wehrmacht swarmed into the western borders of Poland from the north, from the annexed Czechoslovakia in the south, and of course from Germany. That half century of woe continued until almost 50 years later, to the date, September 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, when communism began to recede, and then in the early 90s, the Russian soldiers finally left Poland. The communist soldiers finally left Poland. Now, in September of 1939, these bodies began to pile up. And there's a lot of myths about the invasion of Poland. One of the great myths that I heard as a child, you probably heard it too, was that the Polish military was so foolish that they threw cavalry up against the panzer divisions of Hitler's armies. This is completely false. There's only one instance where that occurred, and that's when troops were attempting to flee against heavy opposition, and the cavalry rode against them to distract the tanks. Half of the cavalrymen died, the rest were captured and probably died as well. But Poland acquitted itself enormously well against Hitler's panzer divisions, against the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. They acquitted themselves much better than the British and the French did in 1940. Hitler came in with 1.5 million troops, came in with 1,500, 1,600 planes. Poland had far fewer troops, and one of the reasons why Poland had so few troops relative to Hitler was because the British and the French had pressured Poland not to mobilize. Mobilize, of course, is when you draw up your reserves, you arm everyone, you move them to the theater of combat. And England and France had said to Poland, don't do it, because we're going to work for peace, and if you mobilize, that's going to inflame Hitler's passions, it's going to provoke him, and that will end up being as a war. Now, after staging, in a classic false flag maneuver, staging an attack on a German radio station when they had German convicts dressed up in Polish uniforms to attack the radio station in Germany, they then used that as the pretext for a full invasion. There was no declaration of war. Now, the entire point of the treaty between France and England and Poland was Poland was supposed to hold off Hitler's invasion for about 2 weeks, while France was able to throw dozens of divisions and thousands of planes against the largely undefended Rhine border of Germany. Poland, in fact, held Germany off for 3 weeks, waiting for France to fulfill its side of the bargain. France did nothing. Now, the British Air Force did fly over German cities Did they attack? Did they drop bombs? No. What did they drop? They dropped leaflets in German saying that Hitler was leading them into a war with some possible goal of the people groaning under a fascistic dictatorship, a National Socialist dictatorship under Hitler. The idea was perhaps they would revolt and perhaps they would be able to change the German war policy as subjected and slave vassals of the Nazis, which of course didn't happen. The Poles fought valiantly, the Poles fought and were able to push back the Wehrmacht at some points, but they were unable to sustain it. They had deployed their troops too close to the border. The German experience and the French experience, of course, in the First World War was of stagnant warfare, was of trench warfare, and Hitler and his generals knew just how destructive that was. So the entire point of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was to punch through enemy defenses, to bypass them and to go around behind them, to cut off their lines of supply, to cut off potential reinforcements, and then of course you could move in with your troops to mop up the last pockets of resistance. This was stunningly effective, and because the Polish troops were so extended, they were able to be cut off, and the reinforcements that were supposed to come in were never able to make it. There was no possibility that any army in Europe could single-handedly have taken on the Nazis at this time. No chance whatsoever. And we saw that in the May 1940 invasion of France, where the combined French and British expeditionary forces were thrown back over the Channel relatively quickly. There was no chance. If you look at the budget, and war is run, they say that a soldier in an army marches on its stomach. You have to have enough food to march. But it is equipped and armed on its money. And if you look at the budget between Germany and Poland, the Polish national budget was smaller than the budget for one city in Germany, Berlin. So there was no chance that Poland could have survived even the Wehrmacht coming in from the west. But very shortly after the Germans invaded, the Russians came in from the other side, because the Germans and the Russians had signed a treaty to carve up Poland. And the invasion of Poland was not an ordinary military invasion. The invasion of Poland was specifically designed and executed, it's a very key phrase, was specifically designed and executed not to invade and take over Poland, but to destroy the Poles, to destroy the Polish culture, to destroy the Polish way of life, to destroy the entire Polish civilization. And this was remarkably effective. When Poland was invaded, the decapitation, in particular, of the educated classes. In the University of Krakow, all of the faculty, the professors, were told, come to a meeting. And then they were dragged out of that meeting, imprisoned, tortured, murdered. 1 out of every 2 lawyers in Poland was murdered. 1 out of every 3 priests was murdered. 1 out of every 3 doctors was murdered. There's an old and horrible cliche that when totalitarianism moves into a country, everybody in glasses gets dragged out and shot. And this occurred horrifyingly in Poland. The depopulation of Poland was extraordinary. More than 1 million Poles were shipped off to labor camps in Germany. More than 1 million Poles were shipped off to labor camps in the Soviet Union. 500,000 Poles scattered from the invasion, never to return. The educated classes were decimated. Out of the Polish population during the Second World War, 1 out of every 5 Poles was killed. 1 million Polish children were orphaned. And if you look at the population as a whole, the concentration of murder and slaughter was in the highest echelons of intelligence. And that is how you destroy a culture. A culture is generated by the artists, by the writers, by the thinkers, by the communicators. And they are the first to get the totalitarian bullet in the forehead. The suffering that occurred in Poland can scarcely be described. Not only at the end of the Second World War, when the Germans deindustrialized was the phrase, but what that actually meant, with everything that was not bolted down, that was even remotely of economic value, was ripped up and taken off by the Germans. The same thing happened when the Germans withdrew from Warsaw in the face of the approaching enemy army. Warsaw was not liberated. Warsaw was destroyed. There was almost no building left standing. It was a Nagasaki-style destruction of a city. The only inhabitants were stray dogs and starved rats at the end of the war. At the end of the war, Poland had been decimated, and rebuilding it under communism was incredibly difficult because communism is so economically inefficient. So you had the intelligentsia destroyed, Jews murdered. Now, to point this out, a lot of Poles were, after the war, implicated or accused of collaboration with the Nazis, but one of the reasons why the Jews were murdered so much in Poland, first of all, from the 18th century on, Poland was home to 4/5 of the world's Jews. Secondly, Poland was far enough away from England and France that the Royal Air Force could have no capacity to attack. So there were reasons why it occurred in Poland more than anywhere else. But the reality is that after the economic destruction, the cultural destruction, the lopping off of the intelligentsia of Poland, and then the imposition of decade after decade of brutal communism, Poland's independence was incredibly hard won. These bodies are what props up Poland's sense of pride and independence. The graves are well maintained. We can look here. The graves are well maintained. The flowers are fresh. It was recently All Saints' Day. I have seen flowers placed lovingly on graves 50 years old, 70 years old, 100 years old. That is a very hard-won memory to maintain. There is a monument in this graveyard to 22,000 Polish officers that were hauled off and murdered in cold blood, slaughtered by the Soviets, who then pinned the blame on the Germans. And a very famous Polish leader was in fact trying to get to England with proof that the Soviets had murdered 22,000 Polish officers when his plane was downed in a suspected act of sabotage, because of course if he had gotten that information to England and it had been published in the British newspapers, any kind of alliance with Russia would have proved impossible. This level of destruction, this level of mass murder, is something which we must never forget. When I am walking through a graveyard full of Polish patriots with tears streaming down my face, there is strength in community. There is power in the tribe. It is a depth of feeling that I have only associated with love of friends and family, love of virtue, and love of wisdom. You atomize people. You alienate them from their tribe, their peer. Maybe they tricked me into fighting alone. But I'll tell you this. I'll tell you this straight up. I don't want to do it alone anymore.
Przede wszystkim wygrał naród polski. Polacy po raz kolejny pokazali, że są zjednoczeni, że tym najważniejszym celem jest Polska sama w sobie.
Nationalism is a leads to the nation state, which manifests itself generally in obedience to the state. And obedience to the state is horribly dangerous. Patriotism, to me, is allegiance to values outside the state. Now, here in Poland, there is, of course, awareness of the dangers of nationalism. There is awareness of the dangers of predatory collectivism, as it was subjugated in the West by the Germans and in the East by the Soviets. There's a very deep understanding of the collectivist dangers of evil, but there is also a great and sweet and mournful celebration of the collectivism of Catholicism, of Christian values and virtues, of freedom, of a restrained state. I would say that Germany, say under Hitler, was nationalistic and therefore were a leash placed around the neck of the people held by the mailed fist of the state. But in Poland, the values are patriotic, which means the values are for freedom, for trade, for independence, for integrity, for virtue. And I think that comes a lot out of the Christian ideals of Poland. In Christianity, if an act is compelled, it cannot be virtuous. In Poland, if something is compelled, it cannot be virtuous. Freedom is essential for virtue. In Germany, subjugation to the state was the virtue, and therefore whatever the state made you do represented the freedom of the race or the nation or the class, and therefore the freedom of the individual was not only not required, but was in opposition to the freedom of the state. Here in Poland, people wish to be virtuous, and because they are Christian and patriotic, they require freedom in order to achieve that virtue. Most Poles would feel that you do not own a virtue that is compelled any more than you own a treasure that is stolen. And there is, very deep in the Polish character, as I've seen, an extraordinarily deep skepticism of authority. And that is a very powerful thing.
Przede wszystkim Polska jest przeciwna masowemu sprowadzaniu do Polski imigrantów obcych kulturowo. Nie chcemy mieć takich problemów w zakresie bezpieczeństwa, jakie ma Francja, Niemcy i inne kraje Unii Europejskiej.
This skepticism of authority is wonderful. This is what I got from Poland, and it is a lot. The monoculture that has survived from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through the Industrial Revolution, into the 21st century in Poland is something to be treasured, respected, admired, and protected. The second thing I got from Poland is that the view of Poland from outside Poland, the ideological view, the leftist view, the collectivist view, that they're all Nazis and fascists and xenophobes and white nationalists and so on, is not only false, is not only wrong factually, it's wrong morally. These are good, decent people who love their country and have suffered enormously to retain its integrity, and they should be celebrated and honored, not slandered for some obscure, nefarious political purpose. That is wrong. The Poles are not guilty. And guilt has been so infused into the hearts and minds of Europeans and of whites that to see a shame-free and guilt-free culture, a resilient, strong culture that is resisting collectivism, is something that moved me more than I can probably ever express, but I hope is encapsulated in the footage that you're seeing in this documentary. And the third and perhaps the most important thing I got from Poland was this is what a serious country looks like. Along with the guilt in the West comes frivolity and hedonism and the selling off of freedoms just for the sake of transitory relief from guilt, or the shallow hedonism of sexuality or drugs or drinking or self-abandon or you name it. The shallowness and hollowness of Western European culture compared to the seriousness and depth of Polish culture is really a startling contrast and something that I will take with me to my grave. Freedom, you see, is like a fire. To have a fire, you need to go and gather the firewood, you need to light the fire, and then, my friends, you know what you need to do? You need to tend that fire. Poland has embodied a memory that the rest of Europe has completely forgotten. The memory of what it means to suffer for your freedoms, and through that suffering, treasure those freedoms and keep them. Poland will last. The fires of liberty in Poland, while flickering and under attack as we saw with the attempted cancellation of the march, the freedoms in Poland are burning strongly, powerfully, and they are protected by very serious people who know what it is like to live under tyranny and therefore respect the effort needed to maintain liberty. Poland is a powerful country. It is a serious country. It is a country that has turned the scar tissue of a brutalized history into an intense muscularity for the defense of liberty and the West. Poland remembers what the rest of us have forgotten, which is this: the fire of liberty, fed by the blood and sweat and toil and bodies of your ancestors, is a delicate thing. Liberty is not constant. It is not a force of nature. It is not a force of gravity. It is not an element of physics. It is something that must be willed and protected and maintained and kept every single generation. Poland remembers what the rest of the West has forgotten, which is that your freedoms, which take generations to build, the fires of liberty that keep your civilization warm, can vanish and go out like that.